Hello. So in this series of videos, I'm going to be doing very brief overviews of different historical modes of reading or schools of literary and cultural theory. I'm going to try and cover a lot of them. Most of them will be 20th and 21st century because this is when we really had a proliferation of schools of critical thought. But in these very brief summaries, I'm going to try and give you a sense of the key ideas, key concerns, key innovations, and maybe some major drawbacks of these different schools. You'll also see that some of these schools have similar sets of concerns, and there's a lot of overlap between different approaches to literary and cultural theory, different approaches to how we read. So my last video in the literary schools of literary and critical theory series was about critical race studies. And quite predictably, I started getting some pushback in the comments from people who think that they know what critical race studies is about or critical race theory is about, but don't really know. I figured this was going to happen. I was on the fence about this, but I have turned off the comments both for this video and for the original video about critical race studies, because realistically, it's just not worth my time and effort to keep telling a bunch of racist fucking idiots that they're racist fucking idiots who don't understand what they're talking about. A big part of the problem is that in the US, critical race theory, which again, as I said in my previous video, is kind of a subset of critical race studies, a broader discipline, but realistically, politicians and reactionaries and right-wingers and all these people who've gotten themselves worked into a frenzy about critical race theory destroying America and their stupid shit that they've imagined here. These people fundamentally do not understand what critical race studies is about. And so I tried to clarify to a certain extent in my previous video. In this video, I'm going to follow up a little bit and respond to some of the comments that I got on that video. In particular, one I got that compared critical race studies to Nazism because it's premised on the idea that some races are good and some races are bad. Now, to this person's credit, they did seem to have a negative view of Nazism, which is a very low bar to jump over, but they managed it. And they opposed racism, or they said they opposed racism. So again, a very low bar. They managed to clear it, so yay. But this idea that critical race studies promotes racism is premised on racial inequality, is premised on the idea that some races are good and some races are bad. No, this is complete bullshit. This is absolutely not what critical race studies is about. Now, there is a slight caveat here. Sometimes individual practitioners of critical race studies will say in uncritical ways that white people are bad or something like this. That's not a critical race studies position, though. That's an important distinction to make. People who believe or follow a particular school of literary or cultural thought can say things that do not align with that school of literary or cultural thought without that reflecting the perspectives of that discipline. So that's worth keeping in mind. Now, what does critical race studies actually think about race? So, critical race studies proceeds from the assumption, supported by biology, supported by sociology, supported by all of these different disciplines, that race is not a biological category. It's not an inherent quality of human beings. Instead, race is a social construct. So what does that mean? That means that within particular societies, say the United States, New Zealand, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, France, whatever it is, within a particular society, that society constructs racial categories. It determines what groups count as particular races and who belongs to which of those categories. Now, one of the things that's really, really important to know about this is that these are not objective categories. These are not scientific categories. They're not measurable categories. And what groups of people fit into these particular categories varies dramatically over time. So, if we take the United States, for instance, probably the two most significant racial groups in the U.S. in terms of shaping our national character is white people and black people, or African Americans. Who counts as an African American? This may seem on the face of it like a fairly simple question, but actually it isn't necessarily. So, on the one hand, you've got the descendants of slaves brought over by Europeans during the colonial period and the period of the early republic. So you have people whose ancestors came directly from Africa and were transported against their will to what's now the United States. But then you've also got people who moved to the U.S. from Jamaica or Brazil or other Caribbean islands, places like this, who are of African descent. So they've got the sort of intermediary step. Then you've got people from modern-day African nations, modern-day Caribbean nations, who have moved to the U.S. very recently. So let's say you have someone who has moved to the U.S. from Nigeria in 2020. Are they an African American? What if they've got citizenship in the U.S.? Are they an African American? So that's one way of looking at it. But we can also look at white people, the idea of white people in the U.S., which I actually think is kind of more interesting in some ways because it's more surprising. Today, we tend to, again, I think of white people as a fairly self-explanatory category. But historically, it's not. So, for instance, am I a white person? I mean, if you were just looking at me on this video and you knew nothing else about me, you would probably say, yes, you appear to be a white person. And that appear to be is an interesting qualification. If you said, yes, you are a white person, then you are making a definitive statement about me, and that may or may not be true. On my mother's side, I am Irish, Scottish, German, possibly some other things. On my dad's side, I'm Jewish. So, are Jews white? I mean, Ashkenazi Jews. People from sort of Eastern Europe, Poland and Romania, where my ancestors are from, Ukraine, Russia, etc., etc. Are Jews white? It's hard to say. Depends on who you ask. If, as on many of the job applications I've been filling out, you categorize white as including anybody whose ancestry is from Europe or the Middle East, then sure, you sort of skate past that. But historically, Jews are not necessarily considered white. Even more interestingly, historically, at different times, the Irish were not considered white. Eastern Europeans, people from Poland, from Romania, from Lithuania, from Czechoslovakia, these people were not considered white either. If you go back to someone like Ben Franklin, he definitely didn't consider the Irish white. He didn't consider people from Sweden white. Have you seen the Swedes? They are naturally camouflaged with snow. So this idea, like, this is an important thing that people need to wrap their heads around about race, is that race is not an immutable biological truth. It is not a scientific principle. And that's one of the foundational beliefs of critical race studies, is that race is a construct, a social construct. Societies determine what racial categories they're going to acknowledge and how those distinctions are going to be drawn, which also means that those distinctions can change. Nowadays, in the US, people of Irish descent are considered white, but if you went back to the 1840s, no. So this kind of undermines the whole idea that critical race studies asserts that some races are superior to others, because critical race studies would say, well, but what is a race? It's not, you can't have one group be better than another group if those groups are arbitrarily defined, necessarily. So you've got that aspect of it. The other component of this is that critical race studies asserts that racism is also a social construct. And this is actually what critical race studies is about examining. It's about examining social structures. How does society function? And so that can be things like, how has the history of redlining predominantly African American neighborhoods entrenched poverty in certain communities while enhancing the wealth of others? If a particular neighborhood, predominantly African American, is redlined by the people who are in charge of giving business loans, that means that the people who live in that neighborhood, those people are less likely to get loans, whereas a predominantly white neighborhood may be greenlined, may have been historically greenlined. And so that community was going to get a lot more investment. Now, if the white community gets a lot more investment, stuff is going to get better. Public services are going to be better. Resources are going to be better, which means it's a safer investment, and so more money comes in. By contrast, the redlined neighborhood filled predominantly with African Americans, it's not going to get better services. It's not going to get new shops. It's not going to get new amenities, things like this. And the stuff that is there is going to decline, as it does over time, just with use. And so it becomes a worse and worse investment risk. This is a social structure. This is a way in which a particular policy, a particular social idea about risk and security with investments panned out through a racial lens, and that has had ongoing consequences. Social structures are the things that critical race studies actually looks at, and the way that those social structures privilege some groups, deprivilege other groups, and the way that that privileging and deprivileging creates psyches, creates individual experiences of the world, etc., etc. So that's the thing that people, especially reactionaries and right-wingers, and, of course, white supremacists. But you know what? Fuck them. I don't give a shit what they think, because they're idiots. But this is the thing that a lot of people who are opposed to CRT, people who are opposed to critical race studies, seem to fundamentally misunderstand. Is it's not a question of saying white people have privilege and are therefore inherently evil in and of themselves. No, it's about what are the social structures that exist within a society, and how are those social structures set up? What are they set up to do? And in many cases, social structures within a particular society are set up to privilege some groups and deprivilege others. This is actually the same kind of thing that we see with most feminist scholarship. Social structures in a patriarchal society are constructed so that men have particular privileges and women lack those particular privileges, or they have additional constraints placed upon them. It is a question of how society works. Yes, there are issues of individual problems, individuals who are patriarchal, individuals who are sexist, individuals who are homophobic, individuals who are ableist, individuals who are racist, etc., etc. Yes, those things do exist, and those are huge problems, but that's not primarily what these schools of literary and critical studies are set up to do. They are set up to deal with how does society function? How are things organized in order to make sense of a world that is shared? And so that's the thing. That's what critical race studies is ultimately about. It's about figuring out how do societies create structures of inequality. How do those structures of inequality function along racial lines? And then the other thing with critical race studies, this is more true in some disciplines than others, but often disciplines, particularly things like criminology, sociology, political science, these areas of critical race studies may also attempt to diagnose, not just to diagnose the problem, here's how racial inequality is structured in this society, but they will also suggest solutions. We have, for instance, a criminal justice system in which African Americans are disproportionately likely to be convicted and sentenced to prison time for crimes that we know are committed across racial categories at roughly the same levels. A white person, a black person, a Hispanic person, an Asian person, etc., are all likely to smoke marijuana at roughly the same rates, but African Americans and Hispanics were substantially more likely to go to prison for possessing marijuana than white people were. A criminologist might say, okay, we've identified this problem. Clearly, the judicial system has some kind of bias against African Americans and Hispanics, and there are historical reasons for that. Nixon's policy was a big one, but anyway. And so a criminologist might say, okay, what do we now do to solve that problem? We have a system that is unequal. We have inequality built into the structure of this society. What can we do to reform that structure in such a way that we can improve equality? We can create a more equal society. In a way, that is fundamentally the goal of critical race studies. Some disciplines, again, are more practical about that than others. If we're looking at, say, literature and drama, for instance, we may or may not be coming up with practical solutions. But, that's who we are. We're coming up with artistic solutions. But this idea that critical race studies is about supporting racism or increasing racism or something like this is completely contrary to the literal purpose of the discipline, which is to identify structures of inequality and to figure out ways that those structures can be reduced, that society can be made more equitable. That is what critical race studies is about. And I don't give a shit what wrong, stupid thing Fox News or your favorite illiterate Republican politician has told you to get you upset. That's just the way it is.